Welcome everybody. I'm Faisal Saleh. I'm the founder and the executive director of the Palestine Museum US. Today we have a very exciting program. Instead of our usual artist talks series, we have a special program that we will be presenting momentarily. We're all very excited about the program. The program is presented through Zoom and also on Facebook. A recording of the programs will be available on Facebook at the end of the program, as well as on the museum's website and YouTube within one day. At this point, I would like to introduce our head curator, Nancy Nesbitt. In the meantime, I would appreciate it if all attendees who are not part of the panel would turn off their video, please, to ensure best experience for everyone. I will be muting everyone except for people involved in the panel for now until we reach the point where we take in questions from the audience. Nancy, unmute yourself and all yours.
Thank you. The Palestine Museum US is honored today to bring you Sultan Sooud Al Qassemi and our panelists Samia Halabi and Dagmar Painter. Our panelists will pose their questions and Sultan will answer directly. Following answers to questions from our panelists, myself and our founder and director, Faisal Saleh, and time permitting, Sultan will answer questions from our Facebook and Zoom audience. If you are watching on Facebook, please use the comment feature. If you are watching on Zoom, please use the chat feature and preface your question with Q and then colon. Now to our presentation with Sultan's bio first. Sultan Sooud Al Qassemi is a commentator and researcher on Arab affairs and a lecturer on art of the Arab world. Educated at the American University of Paris European Business School, his was a prominent voice on Twitter during the Arab Spring events. Sultan is the founder of the Sharjah-based Barjeel Art Foundation, promoting artists in the Arab world through international exhibitions, including at NYU's Gray Gallery in New York, and the author of a chapter in the book, Taking Shape, Abstraction from the Arab World, 1950s to 1980s. He has lectured and taught at the Hagop Kevorkian Center of Near East Studies at New York University, as well as at Georgetown University and Boston College, teaching the politics of modern Middle Eastern art. He is the founder of a continuing cultural majlis, now online, enabling public participation. We welcome Sultan Sooud Al Qassemi to our series today to discuss art in the Arab world. Our first panelist presenting her questions to Sultan is Samia Halabi. Samia Halabi, now living in New York, was born in Jerusalem during the British Mandate. Her family was forced from Jaffa in 1948. Recognized as one of the Arab world's leading contemporary painters, her work is in museums and private collections in the UAE, US, Europe, Asia, and South America. She's an abstract painter who explored the media of programming computing machines. Halabi is the subject of several monographs and the author of 3. Outstanding among her books is her treatise in word and image about the Kafr Qasim massacre. Samia, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you, Palestine Museum, and thank you, Faisal, for all of this. And most of all, thank you, Sultan, for allowing us to interview you. I don't see Sultan, Faisal, but I will proceed.
You will see him when he starts talking.
Okay, Sultan, I'm going to ask you a multiple question because I only have one question to ask, and it has to do, they're all parts of the same question. It has to do with, I wonder when you started thinking of being a collector? Were you young? Were you, did you feel that urge when you were 15 years old? How did you see art when you were 15? How did you begin? And I know I attended a discussion where you discussed your career as a critic and political writer and commentator. So I wonder where your attitudes towards being an activist collector who does your concern regarding showing women as much as men, where all of this originates and comes from. So if you would put it all together like one big delightful cake and answer it for us, we would be pleased. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samia. Thanks to Dagmar and Nancy as well. And above all, thanks to Faisal and the Palestine Museum. Samia, that is a loaded question. I frankly don't see myself as a collector. I feel that there's a negative connotation to the words collector. When I started Barjeel, I didn't name it after me. So it's not called the Sultan Sooud Al Qassemi art collection, because I feel like it has to have its own identity. It has to have its own, it's just be an entity on its own, and not even, in a way, I know that I am the person who is funding it, but I feel like I don't want to be referred to as a collector. I shy away from that word because of a number of reasons. My interest in art really developed when I was in Paris. I had known a little bit about art in high school, studied the Guernica, for example, during our studies of World War II. But it was really in Paris where I started learning about Impressionist art and French art, European art. And then in around 2000, 2001, my mom and dad and I stumbled upon, by sheer coincidence, an exhibition of Palestinian art. And so since this is the Palestine Museum, it was an exhibition of a Palestinian duo and perhaps two of the most influential Palestinian artists of the 20th century, Tamam Al-Akhal and her late husband, Ismail Shammoud, both of whom were very politically active, giants of our time and their time in the 20th century. And in that exhibition, Samia, my father, became a bit animated and said, I recognize this character. This is about Black September. This painting is about such and such incident. And so I thought, well, there is some kind of correlation, right, between Middle Eastern history and Middle Eastern art. And so this was almost 20 years ago, and the rest is history.
Thank you. Of course, you know, I think of collectors with great love.
I have no doubt.
But I look at you as being more an activist. That's why you know, your concern about showing the work and accumulating knowledge and publishing books has a social, cultural value that is huge. For that, I thank you. And I'll pass it on.
Samia, you can ask more than one question. You know, we didn't really want to put a limit on you asking a single question of us. So if you have another question, since we have the time, please.
I wonder if you would tell us how it is that you developed your discipline about focusing on one area. I know you just commented about your father's commentary, and that's very significant. And experiencing Tamam and her husband was a wonderful beginning. But could you tell us more about that? What led you into a sort of activist, progressive, I should say, a progressive attitude towards Arab art in exhibiting and showing and writing about it?
Samia, when I started buying art in the mid-2000s, about 2003, 4, 5, I was buying art from India, mostly because I was traveling to India every 3 months. I was sitting on a board. I was a board member in a listed company in India. And I was buying art from Pakistan. I was buying art from Iran, as well as the Arab world. So it wasn't really, it wasn't disciplined and focused towards the Arab world. But then I realized that our friends in India, our friends in Pakistan, our friends in Iran were really focused on their country, were really focused in supporting art from their country. And I thought, you know what, there needs to be a collection that complements their lovely art. So that for there to be a dialogue, there needs to be a home for art from the Arab world. And there needs to be more than one home for art from the Arab world. After all, we are 400 million people. So what you need is more than one Madhaf of Qatar, more than one Dr. Ramzi Dalloul in Lebanon, more than one Barjil or whoever focuses on Arab art or even local national art. There are also definitely financial reasons towards this. If I like Impressionist art. I grew up as a teenager, visiting the Musée d'Orsay, but I can't afford an Impressionist painting. Maybe if I sell most of the collection, I could buy an Impressionist painting, but it doesn't have anything to do with my history. It doesn't affect me. It is not consequential to the world. But I really believe that a collection of Iranian art, a collection of Arab art, or Pakistani or Indian, or any of the countries that I feel an affiliation towards, or let's say especially Palestinian art, a collection of especially Palestinian art is very consequential to the world. It has political ramifications because you are contributing towards the state's sustainability of an identity that is under threat of being erased, actively under threat of being erased by a number of factors. Could be political, could be social, could be lack of documentation. And so what we have to do is we need to focus our efforts and our energies and support art from our region. This is what I think.
If my 10 minutes aren't completely over, yesterday, Professor Rabat mentioned a student who wanted to do a thesis on Palestinian art and was completely refused in the USA. So that puts a focus on what you're saying, that scholarship on the subject is very important, and encouraging it is super important for us.
That's correct, I agree.
Thank you. I will pass it on. Thank you.
Thank you, Samia. Nancy? Nancy, unmute, please. Okay.
Thank you again to Samia and to Sultan for excellent questions and answers. Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Dagmar Painter. Dagmar Painter is the founder and curator emeritus of Gallery Al-Quds, the art gallery of the Jerusalem Fund for Education and Community Development in Washington, D.C. There she has curated over 100 exhibitions of Arab American and Middle East contemporary art. Dagmar has taught and lectured in Tunis, Lagos, and Bangkok, among other places, and has published extensively on arts in the Islamic and Middle Eastern world, and now hosts a popular blog, Art Heals. Dagmar, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I'm really, really honored to be in discussion with all of these really powerful forces in the art world. And I'm very happy that you included me. I'd like to talk about the ethics of curating and collecting, and on the other side, see what Sultan's commentary would be on some of the things that I think are very important to consider. I think that curating and collecting art are basically two versions of the same effort, creating visibility and value for artistic endeavors. As collectors and curators, we have a grave responsibility towards not only the makers of art, but also the consumers of art. In many ways, we are gatekeepers, able to open doors for artists by our choices that can impact not only the daily lives of the artists themselves, but also influence the reception and significance of the artist's message. This is particularly important in the world of Arab contemporary art. Opportunities for Arab artists to exhibit and sell their work, both in their home countries and in the diaspora, have increased in recent years, sadly, often because events like war and the refugee crisis have raised awareness in the global north. But despite the increasing proliferation of arts fairs and the inclusion of some Arab artists in major museums and galleries and major art centers in the world, representation is still limited for emerging and mid-career artists. Digital media has greatly helped in this regard, as artists are increasingly able to sidestep the gatekeepers and take their work directly to the public. But not all artists are digitally savvy, and many don't have the global contacts to increase their visibility to the point where they're invited to participate in prestigious local and ultimately international exhibitions. New forms of artistic values have disrupted older forms of value creation. Successful artists today are often more focused on the international market and its needs. Yet today it is more important than ever for Arab artists to have their voices heard. For my part, curating must animate opportunities for new perceptions. This means creating conversations, contextualizing new work within the spheres of art practice, historical reference, biography, and collaborating with the artists to give both voice and direction to their vision, providing a corrective to changing strategies of culture. I try to foreground artists to tell alternate stories of difference. Collectors form a vital partnership in this endeavor. Great collectors collect with two eyes, one on the past, the historical perspective, and one on the future, elevating the work that artists do, helping to foreground its significance, preserving its moment in time, and its timelessness. One last thing, I think it applies to curators, collectors, museums alike. Edward Said said, "Solidarity before criticism means the end of criticism." Our criteria for exhibiting and collecting must include measurable standards of the highest quality in judging artworks. This is the only way to honor both artists and the art they create. I want to thank you for listening to my commentary, and I'd love to hear, Sultan, what you think about the role of the collector as the gatekeeper. Thank you.
Thank you, Dagmar. That is a loaded question as well. Of course, I am not a curator, but in a way, I do curate by acquiring works that go into a collection, and then a curator would come and select from that collection. So in a way, you do end up curating the collection that you are acquiring. And maybe to answer your question about the ethics of collection, this is something that we grapple with in the Arab world very much. I think Dr. Nada Shabbout has written a lot about works that have been stolen from the museums in Iraq, whether they're antiques or modern paintings, but also works that have been stolen from artists' homes. A lot of artists had left Iraq in the 1970s and 80s, and their works, their homes were maybe confiscated or raided, and the works found their way through auctions or through collectors into the international market. The same can be said about art in Kuwait, art in Syria, even in Lebanon, partly Yemen, of course, now Libya, unfortunately. And so there's so much in the region, sadly, that we suffer from in terms of documenting and tracing the origin of art, which poses a challenge to collectors when it comes to buying art. If you buy a work and you are told that this work was stolen, do you return it to the family, or do you return it to the country, or do you try and retrieve your money? And so it's a difficult, it's a dilemma, to be honest with you. It's not a very, very simple question. There was an auction a few years ago here in the UAE, and turns out that one of the paintings was an Iraqi work, and one of the scholars reached out to me, and I alerted the auction house, and they withdrew the painting because the painting was stolen from the Iraqi Modern Art Museum. But do you give it back to the Iraqi Modern Art Museum, or do you send it back to the collector? And so it's not as straightforward as we all wish it to be. Yes, ultimately it has to go back to the museum, but it's not a straight line. There is definitely a number of stops. With regards to Barjeel, for example, we have definitely come across a number of instances where we weren't sure about the authenticity of an artwork or whether the provenance was 100%. And so I try to stay away from these works. But other dilemmas that I face, ethical dilemmas, are: do I buy works, for example, by artists in Yemen? Yemen is a country that's going through major conflict. And so do you buy works from Yemen? Let's say that you boycott and say, I'm not buying a work from Yemen while the country is going through war, but artists need to sell. And so you are supporting them. And so again, it is an ethical dilemma. It's not a straightforward answer, unfortunately, Dagmar. And another thing in the arts world, in terms of ethics, we have to question where the money comes from. Where does Sultan's money come from? I mean, this is something that people have to think about. Is my money from extortion? I don't think so. I've never been in that sort of field. But we have to keep this in mind because it comes back to haunt us one day. Think about it. A lot of these famous families, these big billionaire families in Europe and America, they've been sponsoring museums for 20, 30, 40 years, and now the museums are returning their monies. And of course, it's kind of too late because they already took money in the 1970s and 80s. But where does money to buy art from the region also come from? What do we think about that or not? It's a question that's worth, at least reflecting upon, even though you likely will not find an answer.
No, that's very, very true. There's so many layers to this. One of the things that perhaps could be addressed is what about the mid-career and even the emerging artists? How do collectors interact with them? It certainly changes the dynamic in terms of provenance, for example, because you know who it is. But how to foreground their work and give them some kind of sustenance so that they can eventually get more opportunities to rise in their profession and have more visibility.
I mean, unfortunately, it's not easy. And I think that there's a number of artists who are present here today who can tell you that it's not easy being an artist in the region. It's not a full-time paying job. There aren't too many people who are, especially here in the Gulf, I can say, who are professional artists who do nothing but art. What you have is people who have government jobs, people who work in a government sector, and then they paint on the side. And this is a big misfortune for us because these individuals, they need to have, I don't know what the English word is, but they need to have free time in order to create their beautiful art. The other thing is, if I may be a bit critical, not every person who fancies themselves as an artist actually produce great work. And so what we need is criticism, and we don't have this. There is a word in Persian called ta'aruf. Ta'aruf basically means that, I don't know, in Arabic it's mujamala. Basically, nobody would ever critique me and say, Sultan, your long hair is terrible, but we can't tell you because you're a nice guy, and so we'll never tell you that your long hair is terrible. And so people don't really tell people the truth. They don't tell artists that this series really isn't the best. And sometimes I see that and I think to myself, I can't break this person's heart and say, this is really awful, or this is not well thought out, or I've seen this before, it looks too similar to another artist. So this is something that we need to look at, because if we want to elevate the quality of art in the region, we have to also unleash critics who can write maybe anonymously, but without making it personal, without saying, this is a personal insult. I remember, I'll share this brief story. There was once an artist who had an exhibition in a gallery in Dubai, and this a critic, really not bad critic, he's a good critic, wrote a critique of the exhibition in the newspaper that wasn't too praiseworthy of that show. And so the artist wrote on Facebook, "You are never welcome into any of my shows ever again." This is the kind of attitude that we're dealing with. So how do you expect art, to develop in that atmosphere?
That's true. I think that Samia's comment and your discussion about academics may be something of an answer to that question. If more people are able to do serious study about the continuum and the history of art, especially in the region, in various regions, their studies could really be a kind of informed criticism that would be really helpful and create a very serious approach to looking at these kinds of artists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dagmar. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dagmar. for your questions. Thank you so much, Sultan, for the excellent and informative answers. I'm Nancy Nesvet, as I was introduced, head curator of the Palestine Museum. And I would like to ask Sultan just one question, basically. The Barjeel collection, which you have amassed and chosen, is comprised of art by Arab artists, representational to abstract, of multiple media. Do you see any style, form, or medium as emblematic of any nation or culture within the Arab world? Or conversely, is there a common Arab aesthetic throughout the collection?
Oh, okay. Again, another really good but tough question. Is there a common Arab aesthetic? I think that all art that's being developed in the Arab world has to a large degree its independent identity that is very, very focused or very based upon the history of that country. So you see a lot of, for example, artists in Palestine depicting the Kathiyya, for example. This is something that you see in Palestine more than you would see, for example, in Yemeni art or in art from other parts of the Arab world. But having said that, we definitely have common themes across the Arab world. So one common theme, and unfortunately many of them are conflict, but one common theme is 1948. Another common theme is 1967. Another common theme is Sabra and Shatila. So the massacre of Sabra and Shatila in 1982 produced art from across the region. I can tell you an example of artists in not just Lebanon, but in Syria, in Egypt, in Algeria, in Morocco, in the UAE, in Bahrain, in Kuwait, in Iraq. In all these countries, artists produced a work in response to Sabra and Shatila. The same thing with the Arab Spring. In the Arab Spring, you had a lot of artists who are not from these Arab Spring states, who also responded to the Arab Spring, to the call for democracy and greater rights to individuals. And so, yes, there might not be an exact aesthetic that is overarching across the Arab world, but there are common themes, common individuals, icons like Jamal Abdel Nasser, for example. Things like that that you see reflect in artists from across the region.
Thank you. And again, do you see any particular form, media or style within individual nations?
Yes, I can give the example of Tunisia, for example. In Tunisia was under this French occupation and French colonization, French mandate. And the Tunisians were able to free themselves of the French presence in the 1950s. Within a few years, this female artist called Safiya Farhat took over as the head of the Fine Arts Institute and basically tore up the French sort of instruction book. And she said, art is not just fine painting. Art is not just sculpture. Art could be tapestry. Art could be ceramic. Art could be on glass. Art could be anything that you wanted to be crafts. And so what you had was this unleashing of artistic creativity when the art scene was sort of managed by a local. And so this is definitely an example of the art forms that are developed from within a country that have been suppressed by an outside influence for many decades.
Thank you so much. At this point, I would like to turn it over to Faisal Saleh, founder and director of the Palestine Museum, who has two final questions for Sultan. Faisal?
Thank you. Sultan, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. We're grateful to you for taking the time. I have two questions. The first one is, could you tell us what the state of the Palestinian art is? You probably has a very good view of of the art, the Palestinian art, in terms of its history, the artists who are in it, and where it's heading, etc. What can you tell us about that?
Faisal, that's a great question. There is no one answer that Palestinian art is doing great, but there's a mixed bag. So it's a mixed answer, I think. Palestinian art internationally is thriving. It's doing so well, I believe, that artists like Samia Halabi are doing well. Artists like Hani Zarub, I want to congratulate him, who just a few days ago set a world record, at the Paris auction. A work that was estimated to sell at 10,000 euros sold for 4.5 times that much. So it went for over 40,000 euros, a wonderful piece that was done in response to the Notre Dame fire from a couple of years ago. So that is a great example of Palestinian artists who are thriving. And I just, I don't want to pick on some names, but what Palestinian artists in Palestine suffer from are so many binds, so many obstacles. Number one, there is the occupation that denies them the opportunity to travel with their shows, the opportunity to sell their work, the opportunity to market their work. All these things that the occupation has put a huge stopgap in front of. I remember we were once at the new museum, and we were expecting a panel of Palestinian artists, and they were stopped by the Israeli occupation from traveling, from leaving the West Bank. So this is just an example of, if you can travel and speak at a conference and not sell your work, but sell your ideas that manifest themselves in their work, how do you expect the artists to thrive? Having said that, the Palestinians are very, very agile, and they're very sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? They really are, they really resist this with all their heart and all their spirit. They're fighters. And so one of the things that they do is just refuse to accept the status quo, continue to create art, continue to produce beautiful work, and we need to support them internationally. So again, if we want to buy art from Palestinian artists, we buy it because it's great, but we should buy it also from Palestinian artists inside Palestine. And I think, I'm going to maybe veer into a controversial territory here, and I accept if Samia would want to comment on this, but Palestinian artists who sort of go through the occupation every day of their lives, it is a reflection, it is a presence every day in their lives, also have a unique perspective that Palestinian artists who live outside may not see 100% all the time.
Samia, did you want to comment?
It is absolutely true, Sultan. And it's true of African-American artists in the US and many oppressed people all over the world. We really, have to support each other. I support the Palestinian artists inside their experiences, and I brook no criticism of them. Of course, unless they're doing really bad art. But yeah, I think we need to become international and make those international partnerships. And you're absolutely right. I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you for all your support.
Great. There are 200 pieces of art made by Palestinian artists in Palestine at the Palestine Museum in Connecticut. So anybody is interested in supporting, they're all available. Go to it. Sultan, my next question is kind of related to the first one is, what is the market for Palestinian art? How do you size up the market? A Palestinian artist in Palestine or elsewhere, what can they expect to see in the market for their work?
Well, I mean, I can't really give you a figure and say this is what the art would sell for, but they're definitely, the value is definitely being recognized in Palestinian art. Again, I don't want to talk about Palestinian art in terms of we have to support them because they are under occupation. They happen to be under occupation, but their art is great. And so the art that they produce is beautiful in most cases. But as I give the example of Hani Zarub, for instance, they are setting records. We've seen Palestinian artists produce art that's being sold in auctions in London, in Paris, in Dubai, and elsewhere. They're doing very, very well. I think the Palestinian artists just need to be given a chance. And what you do, Faisal, by exhibiting their work, what Dr. Ramzi Dalloul does in Beirut by exhibiting their work, I think, and elsewhere, of course, this also allows people to experience their art first time. And unfortunately, because Palestine is under occupation, because a lot of us can't visit Ramallah, and we cannot go to the museums there. We cannot go to the West Bank. So we can't experience Palestinian art firsthand unless we do so by proxy. So we cannot, just like we go to Egypt to see Egyptian art, or we go to, Morocco to see Moroccan art, we can't fly to Palestine easily because of the obstacles of the occupation. So I think definitely we need to support Palestinian art, show the work as much as possible, not just online, in person, in our homes. We try to share the stories. And I think that art really can stand on its own feet. Is that the correct saying?
Yes. In other words, we buy the art for its quality and what it stands for, not just because it's from Palestinian artists who are struggling against the occupation. Certainly the art has its own merits and it stands on its own. And I echo your opinion there.
Can I interject?
Sure.
What I'd like to interject is, I don't compare myself to Western art, nor do I think we need to think of Palestinian art as standing on its own feet. I think it stands taller than any European or American art I've seen in the past 200 years, frankly. So the only great stuff I've seen that supports and it stands on is the revolutionary art of the 20th century, the Mexican mural, the Cubists, the Soviet constructivists, and so on. I think Palestinian art and much of Arab art is just absolutely gigantic in its importance. And it will be seen that way in history. I have no doubt about it.
Can I comment about something here, Faisal?
Yes, of course.
So one of the things I tell my students is when you visit a museum, if you visit a museum in the West, say you go to the MoMA, don't photograph the Picasso or the Monet. I'm sure they're lovely works, but people have seen them. They're lovely. I have no problem with the work. Beautiful. But maybe look for work by women artists that aren't getting the attention that they deserve. You know, I'd be more interested in that. Maybe photographed work by minorities, maybe photographed work by African artists, by Arab artists, because this is what we need to shine a light on. And so usually there are only 4 or 5 pieces in the museum, right? So find them, seek them, and support them, because people, these museums that are showing 1% and 2% of women art, you know, I mean, it's basically, partly it's shame on them, but we also need to sort of encourage this and say we are interested in viewing these works. And I agree with Samia that, I'm sorry to say this, I agree with Samia that Arab art, Palestinian art, Middle Eastern art is even greater than art that I've seen anywhere in the world. To be honest with you, it's it's difficult for me to say this, but I have a bit of I have a bit of a bias towards art from my region. I see it as so beautiful. I see it as so moving. I see it as, I mean, it elevates me. It makes me feel good. It makes me feel like we have a history. It makes me feel that it reinforces the ideas that I carry about me being a proud person from this part of the world. And we don't have that many examples, and we need to support that. And I think what Samia said is very important, that one day in the not too distant future, and I remember tweeting this, saying that when I went to the Musée d'Orsay and I saw a queue of people standing to see one of Van Gogh's beautiful paintings, I remember tweeting and saying, one day in my lifetime, people will queue to see the works of Marwan and Samia and Ziya and so many other artists.
Sultan, somebody had a comment on the Hani Zarab sale, and saying that it seems to be that the sale was influenced by the fact that it was a Western theme in the painting, and wondering if there's interest among non-Arabs, non-Palestinians in Palestinian art outside of the Western themes.
I mean, I really think that that's an unfortunate comment, but I think that Palestinian artists or Middle Eastern artists are responding to a human tragedy, a tragedy of humanity, a tragedy of world culture. The Notre Dame is a sort of a human heritage symbol. It's not a symbol just of whatever Parisian or it's a symbol of human heritage. I think it's registered under every possible registration of human heritage. And so there was a devastation. And Hani is an artist who lives in Paris. So he responded to a tragedy in his hometown. So us people from the region, we don't only react to tragedies of our part of the world. We need to stand by tragedies and also good moments of other instances. So Hani responding to Notre Dame is not a negative thing at all. And I don't think it is, I mean, I don't know who bought the artwork, but I don't think it's because it's a Western theme, that's why the price went up. I think, you know, it was a lovely gesture by a Paris-based artist who happened to be Palestinian, who happened to be Arab, who happened, you know, he's a Paris-based artist, and he produced a beautiful abstract response to that tragedy of this burning of this great cathedral of human heritage. And I don't think that it was simply because it was a reflection of a Western theme. And the proof I can give you to this is there were at least another dozen works that responded to the fire of Notre Dame. They didn't all set records. It was that one work that set a record because of the quality.
Thank you.
So,
go ahead.
Make a comment?
Yeah.
One of the things, Sultan, that I think maybe one of the very few things that is good that has come out of this pandemic and our lockdowns is that with all of the virtual exhibitions and online exhibitions and things that people are putting together, it may be the first time that a lot of people worldwide are going to be able to see even more of the work of Palestinian artists, especially artists under the occupation, because we're all in that situation where everything is virtual for the foreseeable future, at least. And it may be a really, really good opportunity for people to be introduced to this amazing art where they would not have been able to travel to see it in real life.
That's correct. I think this pandemic is a great equalizer. None of the museums that have $1 billion endowment, say, let's put it this way, the museums that have $1 billion endowment and the museums that have a zero endowment, both have an opportunity now to show their work equally, almost equally on a level playing field. Of course, if you have a huge endowment, you can pay for advertising, you can pay for a huge camera to come and take high definition images. There's a lot of things, but in reality, you both are online. So you don't benefit from having this giant building in downtown Manhattan that the Palestinian Museum can't afford or Barjeel can't afford, you know, but we're now all online. And so let us do our best to promote our art in this moment.
Excellent thought. And I think, Sultan, that the pandemic and the virtual life that we're all living now is going to have a much farther impact on everything we're doing, not just the art. And this is just the beginning of it. We are going to take some questions from our audience on Zoom and on Facebook here. So Sultan, first question is from Gia, and my question is, do you think that identifying and being identified as Arab artists sometimes stands in the way of us of us being seen as single valid voices, like Western artists who don't have a geographic prefix?
I don't see being an Arab or a Palestinian artist as limiting. I think it's important, especially at a time where we are constantly being targeted, we are constantly being demonized, we're constantly being shown in negative light by media, by politicians, by individuals who are very influential, by presidents of huge, great democracies. These individuals who demonize people from our part of the world, we need to fight this message back. And we need to fight it back with everything that we have. Culture, we need to feel by art, by poetry, by music, by film. And so we have to identify, hey, you think the Arab world produces negative things 24/7? We're going to show you the beauty of the Arab world. Here's our poetry, here's our film, here's our music, here's our painting, here's our sculpture. So we need to take these negative notions and turn them back and present them to the rest of the world. I don't think that it limits artists. I think that in fact it is a huge part of our identity, and we should not negate it. I come across many artists who say, I don't want to be associated with the region. I want to be known as an artist. I understand that. But in reality, the rest of the world sees them as an Arab artist. This is the reality. I sat on boards of museums. This is what happens.
Thank you, Sultan. Next question is from Shad. My question is about researching and evaluating channels of solidarity between artists, art communities within the Middle East, West Asia. It is important to take into consideration the diversity that exists in our region. How can we bring more positivity towards the image of the region while at the same time generate much needed documentation of our art histories? By uniting these different artistic forces into one shared narrative, would this be beneficial to us as individuals and also to art itself?
Thanks. I assume that question is from Shad Abdul Karim, who is a young
Yes.
Kurdish collector. Shad has been doing a wonderful job with his Salam Art Museum. He is buying Iraqi art. He's concentrating on Kurdish art, and the Kurds of the Arab world, the Middle East, including Iran and Turkey and Syria and Iraq, have been marginalized for far too long. We need to promote their art. Their art reflects us, and we are reflected in their art as well. And we are one. Really, in the end, we are one. We are one entity, one people, people who have suffered from the same injustices. And so there is an element of solidarity. Yes, we need to look at all the ethnic groups, all the minorities, the Armenians of the Arab world, the Kurds of the Arab world, the Turkmens, the Persian Arab, the African Arab, I don't want to forget someone, the Jewish Arabs, all the people from the region who have been who haven't had a chance to be promoted from the Arab world. I think we need to do our best to showcase their art as part of our sort of whole Arab art history.
Thank you. Next question is from John. Events such as 48, 67, I assume 1948, 1967, etc., have prompted significant art. At this moment, as Palestinian artists are under a double threat of annexation and the pandemic, is this a moment that foments new art? What are you seeing?
Oh, I don't know how to answer that. I think the pandemic is something that's still ongoing. You know, I always hear on the BBC, there's this trailer saying this could be the story of our lifetimes. And it saddens me so much to think that the pandemic could be the story of our lifetimes. I would much rather think of it as us defeating the pandemic is the story of our lifetime. So I don't want the pandemic to be the story of my life. I want to survive and see the end of this and see human being and humanity triumph, and then see the art that was being produced as part of us defeating this global threat to us all as human beings. I am sure there are artists who are producing lovely work, but I need to wait for a few years before I assess whether it is great or just momentary.
Sultan, there's a personal question for you. Somebody would like to know where you teach, and any of your classes are available online for people to watch.
I was teaching in a number of US universities, and now I will be teaching in Paris for the fall. None of my classes are online, but many of my lectures are online.
I assume they're on your website somewhere, right?
That's correct.
Okay, excellent. Another question, do you have any knowledge about restoration efforts for art in Palestine that was damaged or went missing during periods of violence? And how does this compare to restoration efforts in other Arab countries that are experiencing unrest, Syria, Libya, Yemen, etc.?
I'm afraid I'm not too familiar with restoration efforts within Palestine. I do know that there are a number of restorers in Palestine. I can give you the example of what we've been doing at Barjil. Initially, in the first few years of Barjil, we were sending artworks to London to be restored. But now we have found a restorer here in the UAE. And so we are working almost exclusively with her. And because we believe that we have to support our local industry. And she's a wonderful restorer. And I recommend her to anyone, and her work is just as good as sending the work to Europe. So we should support our local industry. With regards to art from Yemen and other parts of the Arab world, I think that much of the damage is not to modern art, but to antiquities. And so that requires an entirely different expertise in restoration, which I don't know much about. I think there are people here today who can speak much better to that question.
Thank you, Sultan. A question from our mutual friend Rami in New York. He says, I would love to know Sultan's views on Arab/Palestinian photography. Is there any collection of Arab photography? If not, why?
I mean, yes, Arab photography is now over 100 years old. It's a wonderful medium. We've got some photographs, for instance, by an Armenian Egyptian artist called Van Leo, who was very active in the mid-20th century. He photographed abstracts, surrealists, nudes. He was very, very active. There is an entity in Lebanon called the Arab Image Foundation, AIF. And if you go on their website, they've been very active. People started gifting them collections. And so there are things that we take for granted, such as family collections and family albums. Oh, this is just a photograph of my grandparents by the beach. It's not really that important. Or this is a photograph of my grandfather in Beirut in the 1950s. So these are things that we take for granted as being personal, and maybe have no value have no international value, but they do have a lot of value because they capture a moment in the history of the Arab world. And this is maybe an opportunity for me to remind people, if you come across family albums, rather than throw them away, gift them to a museum, gift them to an entity in the UAE. NYU Abu Dhabi now is accepting gifts of photographs. In Lebanon, there is an entity, the Palestinian Museum in Ramallah would accept photographs. I suppose there are a number of other entities that would accept historic photographs, not just of regional leaders, but of everyday moments.
Yeah, Sultan, thank you. And let me add that the Palestine Museum US in Connecticut welcomes any donations of historic photographs, and we do have an increasing collection. In fact, I wanted to talk about one particular photograph. We had a photograph on the wall that was taken in 1939, and people were doing selfies in front of it, and somebody noticed the photograph and told us that was his mother in that photograph, and then they sent us a current picture. And last week they told me that their mother was celebrating her 100th birthday and invited me to join their Zoom party, which I definitely joined. And it was such a great event with about 40-50 of her descendants around and relatives around the world singing happy birthday to her. And I held my iPhone with the photo from the museum wall when she was 19 and about to get married, and then against her view at age 100. And if that's not a great thing, what else? Anyway, Nancy, help me out. Are there any more questions that you have, or it's kind of difficult monitoring two sources and managing this whole thing at the same time. So perhaps you can, you're on mute. Unmute.
Thank you so much. Actually, I have a question, Sultan, please. You've discussed how we should look at Arab art at museums in Paris and around the world, that we shouldn't only look at Western art there. Yet at Barjeel, you show work limited to Arab artists in Sharjah. All around the world, there are museums that limit the artwork there to a particular audience, and also only exhibit particular artists in a group, as in the Women's Museum in Washington, as in the African American Museum here, African museums around the world, etc. The museum in Ramallah. Do you hope that once artists become known in the Near East from people seeing artwork there, that they will be sought by Western collectors and brought to museums in the West? Or is there another program to the museum being limited to Arab artists and you hoping that they will be exhibited in the West?
So the reason we show art by Arab artists exclusively, and by the way, these include artists who are Muslim, Christian, Jewish, from all different ethnicities of the Arab world. So it's not an ethnic Arab, it's a citizenship issue. It's not an ethnicity issue. But the reason we show that is, for lack of a better word, is that Arab art is the underdog. I don't like to use that word, but it's the art that is not being shown anywhere in the world. So we need, it's like going to an African American college or university and say, hey, how come you get to have your own college? Because they are the ethnic group that is not having as many opportunities as other ethnic groups. And so that is why in the US you have issues like affirmative action, because you want to give people an opportunity. Now imagine if you had affirmative action in museums where you say you have to show a minimum 25% women art. Why not? I mean, why do we have to have 95% male art? I don't think male art is so much is that times better than women art. In fact, I find much women artists to be producing work that is even better than male artists. One quick example is when we did the current Barjeel exhibition of 130 works. This is a 50-50 exhibit, so it's 50% male, 50% female. I sent scholars and I said, did you feel like the quality of the art was reduced once we took out the 80% male, 20% female ratio and we made it 50-50? Do you feel like the quality of the art suffered? And no one said that it suffered. Everyone thought that, in fact, the quality was enhanced because now we're actually seeing works by the different group that was underrepresented. And when I show art in international museums or Arab art, do I want Western collectors to buy it? Frankly, my answer is I want Arabs to appreciate Arab art first. So this is my first challenge is people from the region should appreciate our art. And then my second goal or objective is for Westerners or Easterners from outside the region to appreciate our art. My problem is that young Palestinians, young Emiratis, young Saudis, young Iraqis don't know our art as well. If they do know, there's one or two artists. It's the same issue with women in the US. So you go to any person and you say, what women artists do you know? And of course, they would tell you, oh, maybe they would say Georgia O'Keeffe. Or they might say Frida Kahlo. And then they might say, oh, I know Tamara Lempicka. Or they'll say, and then they'll struggle to remember maybe more than 6 or 7 names. Why? It's partly because the museums haven't been showing their work. It's partly because society hasn't been promoting works by women. So we need to educate ourselves in the region. We need young Palestinians to know not only great Palestinian artists, but artists from the region.
So Sultan, you'll be happy to know that the last exhibit we had at the museum, which was opened March 8th, which was the last live event we had due to the virus, included 50 Palestinian women artists with 200 works of art. And we basically emptied the whole museum and filled it up with 50 women's work. We didn't have, we don't have any men art. It was all 100% women, 50 women, 200 pieces.
Faisal, I will disagree with you slightly here. I will disagree with you. You're my host. I respect you. I know you can kick me out. But I think that we shouldn't be showing women art exclusively. I'm against this idea. I think that we shouldn't compartmentalize and say, hey, we're going to show women art. I think women art should be a constant feature. 50-50 always is what I think. I think curators should not be allowed to get away easily by showing majority women, majority male artists anymore. I think that there should be a bit of a shame. There should be a shame. Curators should apologize and issue a statement and say, we're very sorry, but in this instance, we weren't able to show more than 30% women because we were limited. I think that it should be taboo. It should be like, for example, having a government cabinet that's made only of men. So now cabinets should be women and men, for instance. So this should be something that is equally shameful, I think.
I agree with you. I think it was in connection with the International Women's Day on March 8th this year. And that's the only reason. Normally we would have a balancing, but thank you anyway. I think we're out of time. I wish we could continue this for a few more hours. I would really like to thank Sultan. We're very grateful for you taking the time to be with us and sharing your insight with us today. I would also like to thank our distinguished panelists, Dagmar Painter, Samia Halabi, and our own Nancy Nesbitt, our curator. Thank you also to our audience from the 30 countries who made up our audience today on Zoom, and thank you to the people who joined us on Facebook. Thank you so much, Sultan, and we wish you a nice evening, and we hope to hear from you again in the future.
Thank you for inviting me, Faisal, Dagmar, Samia, and Nancy. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody, ma'as salama. Thank you.
Salamat.
Bye-bye.